An old man who inherited a snowed-in mansion arrives at a forgotten estate buried under winter snow, believing it's nothing more than an old family property left behind by time. But while exploring the silent rooms of the mansion, the old man who inherited a snowed-in mansion discovers a hidden passage leading to the attic where a mysterious safe has been locked away for generations. What he finds inside that safe isn't just a hidden fortune. It's a discovery powerful enough to change his life forever. Subscribe for more powerful stories and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. The snow was falling quietly outside when Harold Whitman sat alone by the small window of the roadside motel. The glass was fogged from the cold, and every so often he wiped it with the sleeve of his worn flannel shirt, watching the white flakes drift slowly through the night. Harold was 73 years old, the kind of man people rarely noticed. For more than 4 decades, he had worked long shifts at a steel fabrication plant outside Pittsburgh. The work had been hard on his body. His hands were rough, his back slightly bent, and his knees reminded him of every winter he had ever spent lifting metal heavier than any man should carry alone. But Harold had never complained. He believed in simple things: show up on time, work hard, keep your promises, take care of your family. For most of his life, that had been enough. But life has a way of changing the rules when you least expect it. Just a few nights earlier, Harold had been sitting at his son's dinner table when the conversation turned quiet, and the words that followed were colder than the snow outside. "Dad, we can't keep doing this." Now, Harold Whitman sat in that little motel room with one suitcase beside him, wondering how a man could spend his entire life giving everything to his family and still end up with nowhere left to go. The motel room was quiet except for the low hum of the heater struggling against the winter cold. Harold Whitman sat on the edge of the narrow bed, his elbows resting on his knees, staring at the faded carpet beneath his boots. The room smelled faintly of old smoke and cheap cleaning solution, the kind of place travelers stopped for a night and forgot by morning. But for Harold, it felt like the end of the road. Just 3 days earlier, he had been sitting at the dinner table in his son's house, the same house where he had spent the last 3 years helping raise his grandchildren, fixing broken sinks, mowing the lawn, and quietly handing over most of his small Social Security check each month to help with bills. He had never thought of it as charity. To Harold, it was simply family helping family. That night had started like any other. Dinner plates clinked softly against the table. The grandchildren laughed about something from school. Snow had begun to fall outside the windows, the kind of gentle snowfall that made the world feel peaceful. But Harold noticed something was different. His son Derek barely looked at him during dinner. His daughter-in-law kept glancing at her phone. The room felt tense in a way Harold couldn't quite explain. Finally, Derek cleared his throat. "Dad, we need to talk." Those 4 words had a way of making a man's heart sink. Harold looked up slowly, setting down his fork. "Sure, son. What's on your mind?" Derek rubbed the back of his neck the way he used to when he was nervous as a boy. "Vanessa and we've been thinking about the future, about the kids, about moving." Harold nodded slowly. "Well, sometimes a change can be good." Derek didn't smile. "We're moving to North Carolina. Vanessa's sister has a place there. The schools are better. The cost of living is cheaper. It's a fresh start." For a moment, Harold simply absorbed the news. "That's a big decision," he said gently. "When do you leave?" Derek's voice grew quieter. "In 2 weeks." Harold leaned back slightly. "Well, I suppose we'll have to figure out how to pack everything." That was when Derek finally looked him in the eyes, and the expression on his son's face made Harold's stomach tighten. "Dad, you're not coming." The words hung in the air like a door slamming shut. For a long moment, Harold didn't speak. He thought maybe he had misunderstood. "I'm sorry," Derek exhaled slowly. "We can't take you with us. The new place is smaller. And honestly, it's been hard. The doctor appointments, the medication, the extra responsibility." Responsibility. Harold felt the word settle deep in his chest. "I've tried not to be in the way," he said quietly. "It's not about being in the way," Derek replied quickly, though even he didn't sound convinced. "It's just, we need to focus on our own family right now." Harold looked around the table. The grandchildren had been sent upstairs. His daughter-in-law stared down at her hands. And suddenly Harold realized something painful. This conversation had been planned. "When were you going to tell me?" Harold asked softly. "Tonight," Derek said. There was a long silence. Then Harold asked the question that mattered most. "Where am I supposed to go?" Derek shifted uncomfortably. "I found a motel near the highway. They have a weekly rate. It should give you time to figure something out." Something inside Harold broke in that moment. Not loudly, not dramatically, just a quiet crack deep in the place where a father's heart keeps its hope. He stood slowly from the table. "All right," he said. Derek looked surprised. "You're not going to argue?" Harold shook his head. No point arguing when a decision's already been made. He walked upstairs to the small bedroom he had used for 3 years. There wasn't much to pack. A few shirts, 2 pairs of jeans, his shaving kit, and an old photograph of his late wife that he kept beside the bed. 20 minutes later, he carried a single suitcase down the stairs. Derek avoided his eyes as he opened the front door. Cold air rushed inside, carrying the smell of fresh snow. Harold paused at the doorway and looked back at the house. The same house where he had once helped paint the nursery for his first grandchild. The same house where he had spent countless evenings reading bedtime stories. "Take care of the kids," he said quietly. Derek nodded but didn't respond. Outside, the cab driver loaded Harold's suitcase into the trunk. As the car pulled away, Harold watched the house grow smaller in the snowy darkness. He didn't cry. At 73 years old, a man learns to carry his pain quietly. But that night, sitting alone in a cheap roadside motel with nothing but a suitcase and memories, Harold Whitman realized something he had never imagined possible. For the first time in his life, he had nowhere left to go. The second night in the motel was the hardest. The snow had grown heavier outside, piling against the windows and burying the parking lot in quiet white drifts. The neon sign outside flickered red and blue through the curtains, casting strange shadows across the walls. Harold Whitman lay on the narrow bed, fully dressed, staring at the ceiling. Sleep wouldn't come. Every time he closed his eyes, memories crept in like unwelcome visitors. He remembered teaching Derek how to ride a bicycle on a cracked sidewalk 30 years earlier. He remembered staying up all night beside his son's hospital bed when Derek had broken his arm at age 10. He remembered working overtime shifts so Derek could afford college. A lifetime of small sacrifices. And yet here he was, alone in a roadside motel room. Harold sighed and sat up slowly. His joints protested as he swung his legs off the bed. He walked to the window and looked out at the snow-covered highway. Cars passed occasionally, their headlights cutting through the darkness before disappearing again. Each one was carrying someone somewhere. But Harold had nowhere left to go. He turned back toward the bed and reached for the small envelope that held the last of his money. Inside were a few crumpled bills and some coins. Enough for maybe another 2 nights. After that, he didn't know. Harold sat down again, rubbing his tired eyes. That was when the phone rang. The sound startled him so much that he nearly dropped the envelope. The motel phone sat on the small nightstand beside the bed. No one had called it since he arrived. For a moment, Harold simply stared at it. Then it rang again. Slowly. Cautiously. He reached over and picked up the receiver. "Hello." A man's voice answered on the other end, calm, professional. "Am I speaking with Mr. Harold Whitman?" Harold frowned slightly. "Yes, this is Harold." "Mr. Whitman, my name is Franklin Pierce. I'm an attorney calling from Montpelier, Vermont. I've been trying to locate you for several days." Harold blinked in confusion. An attorney? He felt his stomach tighten. "Look, if this is about any bills or something like that, I can assure you—" No, the lawyer interrupted gently. "Nothing like that, sir. I'm calling regarding the estate of Eleanor Whitlock." The name meant nothing at first. Harold leaned back slightly. "I'm sorry. I don't think I know anyone by that name." There was the sound of papers shuffling on the other end. "Miss Whitlock was your mother's cousin, according to our records. She passed away 2 weeks ago at the age of 96. Harold searched his memory. A faint image surfaced. An elderly woman he had met once as a small boy at a family reunion somewhere in Massachusetts. White hair. Sharp eyes. He hadn't seen her since. "I remember her, barely," Harold said slowly. "Yes, well," the lawyer continued. "Miss Whitlock had no children, no surviving siblings, and very few remaining relatives." Harold waited, unsure where the conversation was going. The lawyer cleared his throat. "Mr. Whitman, you are the last living relative listed in her will." Harold sat up straighter. "I'm what?" "Miss Whitlock left her property and remaining estate to you." For a moment, Harold thought he had misheard. "That can't be right," he said quietly. "I'm afraid it is. The property in question is located outside the town of Colton, Vermont. It's an old family residence that has been in the Whitlock line for over a century." Harold rubbed his forehead. "Why me? I haven't spoken to that woman in 60 years. The lawyer paused. "I cannot speak for her reasons, Mr. Whitman, but her will was very specific." Another pause. Then the lawyer added something that made Harold's heart beat faster. "However, there is a condition." Harold's stomach tightened again. "What kind of condition?" "The will requires that the heir take physical possession of the property within 7 days of notification." Harold glanced at the snow outside the window. 7 days? "Yes, sir. Today is already day 4. Silence filled the room. Finally, Harold asked the obvious question. "What happens if I can't make it there?" The lawyer's voice softened. "Then the property and all associated assets will transfer to the state." Harold looked down at his worn boots. He thought about the motel bill, about the empty envelope of money, about the life he had just lost. "Mr. Pierce." "Yes. I don't have a car that can make that kind of trip in this weather." The lawyer hesitated. "I understand this is sudden, Mr. Whitman, but if you can find a way to reach Vermont before the deadline." He paused. "You may discover that Miss Whitlock left behind something quite significant." Harold stared out the window again. The snow continued falling, thick and relentless. A long drive, a storm, a house he had never seen, and a deadline only 3 days away. For a long moment, Harold said nothing. Then, finally, quietly, he asked the only question that mattered. "What's the address?" Harold Whitman stood by the motel window for a long time after the call ended. The receiver still rested in his hand. Outside, the snow had grown heavier. The parking lot lights glowed through the storm like blurry halos, and the wind pushed thick waves of white across the empty asphalt. 3 days. That was all the time he had. 3 days to travel hundreds of miles through a winter storm, to claim a house that belonged to a woman he barely remembered. Harold slowly placed the phone back onto the receiver. For several minutes he didn't move. He simply sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the floor, while the heater rattled weakly against the cold. His mind kept returning to the same thought. Why would she leave anything to me? Eleanor Whitlock had been little more than a shadow in his childhood memories. An elderly woman at the edge of a crowded family gathering, quiet, observant, the kind of person who seemed to notice everything without saying much. He hadn't spoken to her since he was 10 years old, and yet somehow she had chosen him. Harold rubbed his tired eyes. This doesn't make sense, he muttered to himself. But another thought followed close behind. It didn't have to make sense. Right now, it was the only chance he had. Harold looked down at the envelope containing the last of his money. He counted the bills slowly. $23. That was everything. He let out a quiet breath. "Well, Harold," he said softly into the empty room, "you've faced worse than this." 40 years in a steel mill had taught him one simple truth. Sometimes life gives a man only two choices: stand still and watch everything fall apart, or move forward and hope something good waits on the other side. Harold stood up. His joints protested, but he ignored them. He walked to the small dresser where he had placed his car keys earlier. They belonged to an old 1994 Ford pickup truck parked outside beneath the snow. The same truck he had driven for nearly 20 years, rusted along the edges, heater that worked when it felt like it, tires that probably should have been replaced 2 winters ago. But the engine still started. Most days. Harold pulled on his heavy coat and stepped outside. The cold hit him immediately, sharp and biting. Snow crunched under his boots as he crossed the lot toward the truck. The old Ford looked like it had already been buried halfway. Harold brushed snow from the windshield with his sleeve and opened the door. The seat creaked as he climbed in. For a moment, he simply sat there, gripping the steering wheel. The cab smelled like old leather and motor oil. Familiar. Comforting. This truck had carried him to thousands of early morning shifts. Through rainstorms. Through blizzards. Through the long, quiet drives home after 12-hour days at the mill. Harold inserted the key. He hesitated. "You and me, old girl," he murmured to the dashboard. Then he turned the key. The engine coughed once. Twice. A third time. Then finally roared to life with a rough, rattling growl. Harold couldn't help smiling. "Still got some fight left in you." He let the engine warm while the defroster slowly began clearing the windshield. Inside the cab, Harold reached into the glove compartment. He found an old folded road map of the northeastern United States. The paper was worn and yellowed from years of use. He spread it across the steering wheel. Colton, Vermont. He traced the route slowly with his finger. Pennsylvania, New York, then north into the mountains of Vermont. Nearly 9 hours in good weather. And this was far from good weather. Harold leaned back in the seat. A younger man might have hesitated. But Harold Whitman was not a younger man. At 73, fear had lost most of its power over him. When you've worked your whole life in a factory full of roaring machines and falling steel, a snowstorm doesn't seem quite so frightening. Still, he knew the truth. This trip could be dangerous. The roads would be icy, visibility poor, and if the truck broke down somewhere in the mountains, there might not be anyone around to help. But Harold thought about something else. He thought about the motel room, the empty envelope, the life he had just lost. Staying where he was would lead to only one ending. Slowly, quietly, disappearing. Harold folded the map again. "All right," he said quietly. The heater finally began blowing warm air. The windshield cleared. Harold shifted the truck into gear. Snow crunched beneath the tires as he pulled slowly onto the highway. The road ahead was long. The storm was only getting worse. and somewhere far beyond the white horizon waited a house he had never seen. A house that would soon reveal secrets buried for nearly a century. Harold Whitman tightened his grip on the steering wheel and drove into the storm. By the time Harold Whitman crossed into the mountains of Vermont, the storm had begun to fade. The snow was still falling, but softer now. The violent winds of the night before had settled into a quiet hush that blanketed the countryside. Harold's hands ached from gripping the steering wheel for so many hours, and his back protested every bump in the road. But when the small wooden sign for Colton appeared beside the highway, he felt something stir inside his chest. Relief, hope, maybe both. The town itself was small. Just a handful of buildings along a narrow main street, an old diner, a gas station, a church with a white steeple rising above the trees. Harold stopped at the gas station and unfolded his map again. Hartwell Road, he muttered. The clerk inside the station, a young man with a thick beard and tired eyes, pointed him toward a narrow road that disappeared into the woods. "You heading up there?" the clerk asked. Harold nodded. "That old Whitlock place? I believe so." The young man gave a slow whistle. "Haven't seen anyone living there in decades." Harold simply thanked him and returned to the truck. The road leading out of town was little more than a narrow strip of asphalt winding through dense forest. Snow-covered trees leaned over it like silent guardians. The farther Harold drove, the quieter the world became. No traffic, no houses, just the steady rumble of the old truck engine and the endless white of winter. After nearly 20 minutes, the trees finally opened. And there it was. Harold slowed the truck to a stop. Before him stood a massive stone mansion, rising from the snow like something out of another century. Its tall windows were dark. Snow blanketed the roof and clung to the stone walls. Long icicles hung from the edges like frozen daggers. The iron gate at the entrance leaned slightly to one side, half buried beneath years of winter storms. The place looked as though time itself had forgotten it. Harold stepped out of the truck slowly. The cold air bit into his lungs, but he hardly noticed. He simply stood there staring. "Well," he whispered to himself, "I suppose this is it." He walked through the open gate and up the long snow-covered driveway. Each step crunched loudly in the stillness. The closer he got, the larger the house seemed. The front door was made of thick oak, carved with intricate designs that had faded with age. Harold reached out and grasped the iron handle. For a moment, he wondered if it would even open. Then he pushed. The door groaned loudly as it swung inward. A wave of cold, dusty air drifted out from the darkness. Harold stepped inside. His boots echoed softly against a marble floor. The entry hall was enormous. A grand staircase curved upward toward the second floor. A chandelier hung from the ceiling, draped in cobwebs but still magnificent beneath the dust. Portraits lined the walls, stern faces from another era staring down at him silently. Harold removed his hat and held it in his hands. It felt strange, standing there alone in a house that had once held so much life. "Hello," he called out softly. Only silence answered him. He spent the next hour exploring carefully. Room after room revealed itself like chapters in a forgotten story. A dining room with a long table that could seat 20 people. A library filled with books whose pages had yellowed with time. A music room where an old piano rested beneath a sheet of dust. It was clear the house had once been magnificent, but it had also been alone for a very long time. Eventually, Harold found himself in the library again. Tall bookshelves stretched from floor to ceiling. He ran his fingers along the spines of the old books as he walked slowly around the room. That was when he noticed something unusual. One section of the bookshelf didn't quite match the others. The wood looked slightly newer. The spacing between the shelves seemed uneven. Harold frowned. He had spent 40 years fixing machines and solving mechanical problems, and experience had taught him something important. When something doesn't fit, there's usually a reason. He began removing books from the shelf one by one. Behind them, hidden in the shadows, he found a small brass lever. Harold stared at it. Well, now. He hesitated for only a moment before pulling it. For several seconds, nothing happened. Then suddenly, click. The entire bookshelf shifted. Slowly, silently, it swung outward like a door. Behind it was a narrow staircase spiraling upward into darkness. Harold felt a chill run down his spine. He found a flashlight in the truck and returned a few minutes later. The beam of light cut through thick dust as he climbed the hidden steps. At the top of the staircase was a small door. Harold pushed it open. The attic stretched across the entire length of the house. Old trunks and wooden crates sat stacked along the walls. Filing cabinets filled with yellow documents stood quietly in the shadows. But what caught Harold's attention immediately was something else. In the center of the attic stood a large steel safe, nearly 6 feet tall, old, heavy, and clearly hidden there for a very long time. Harold slowly approached it. Dust covered its surface. The large combination dial glinted faintly in the beam of his flashlight. He ran his hand across the cold metal. For a long moment, Harold Whitman simply stood there in silence, because somehow, deep in his bones, he knew this safe had been waiting a very long time for someone to finally open it. Harold Whitman stood quietly in the center of the attic, the beam of his flashlight resting on the tall steel safe. For a long moment, he didn't move. The attic was silent except for the faint creaking of the old house settling against the cold. Dust floated slowly through the air like tiny snowflakes caught in the light. Harold stepped closer. The safe was older than anything he had ever seen in a bank or factory office. Thick steel walls, a heavy iron handle, and in the center, a large combination dial worn smooth by hands that had likely turned it many years ago. He ran his fingers across the metal. Cold, solid, waiting. Now, what were you hiding up here? He murmured. Harold searched around the safe for clues. Old wooden boxes sat nearby, some filled with papers, others with ledgers written in careful handwriting that dated back nearly a century. He flipped through a few pages, though most of the financial language meant little to him. But one envelope caught his attention. It sat alone on a small table beside the safe. The paper had yellowed with age, but the writing on the front was still clear. To whoever finds this, Harold picked it up slowly. His hands, rough from a lifetime of work, suddenly felt strangely unsteady. He opened the envelope. Inside was a single letter, written in elegant cursive. Harold cleared his throat and began reading aloud in the quiet attic. My name is Eleanor Whitlock. If you are reading this, then the house has finally found its next guardian. Harold frowned slightly. Guardian, he continued. My husband, Charles Whitlock, built his fortune through invention and investment during the early years of the 20th century. But we learned something during the Great Depression that many wealthy men never understood. Money stored in banks can disappear overnight, so Charles chose another path. Harold glanced toward the safe. A slow realization began forming in his mind. He read on. Everything that mattered most to us, we kept here, protected, hidden from the storms of the world. Harold swallowed. His eyes drifted again to the safe. If you have found this letter, then you are the last person in our family line who may inherit what remains of our life's work. There was a short pause in the writing before the final line. The combination to the safe is the date Charles and I were married. Below that, 4 numbers were written clearly. Harold stared at them. For a moment, he felt like an intruder standing inside someone else's story. But then he remembered something. This house, this letter, this safe, had been left to him. Harold folded the letter carefully and placed it back on the table. Then he stepped forward. The dial felt heavy beneath his fingers. He turned it slowly. 1 number, then the next. The quiet ticking of the mechanism echoed in the attic. Harold's heart began beating faster. For reasons he couldn't fully explain, it felt like opening this safe might change everything. When the final number aligned, he grasped the thick iron handle. He hesitated, just for a moment. Then he pulled. At first nothing happened. Then, thonk. A deep mechanical sound echoed inside the safe. The door shifted. Harold pulled harder. With a long, metallic groan, the heavy door slowly swung open. The flashlight beam fell inside, and Harold Whitman froze. For several seconds he simply stared, unable to breathe. Because inside the safe was gold, bars of it, stacked neatly on thick wooden shelves. Dozens of them. Their surfaces gleamed even through a layer of dust, reflecting the light like tiny suns in the darkness. Harold stepped closer. Good Lord. But the gold was only the beginning. Next to the bars were wooden boxes filled with coins. Rare coins. Silver dollars from the 1800s. Gold eagles. European pieces older than the United States itself. Further back inside the safe were bundles of bearer bonds wrapped in protective paper. Harold picked one up carefully. He stared at the printed value. $100,000. Another stack. Another. His hands trembled. Harold backed away slowly, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. He had spent his entire life counting every dollar, stretching paychecks, worrying about bills. And now he was standing in front of a fortune hidden away for nearly a century. His flashlight drifted across a large leather ledger resting on the bottom shelf. Harold opened it. Inside were detailed handwritten records of the Whitlock family fortune. Investments, precious metals, compound growth calculations written over decades. Harold flipped to the final page. There, written in careful ink, was the last entry. Estimated total estate value adjusted for growth. $184 million. Harold sat down slowly on an old wooden crate. The attic spun slightly around him. $184 million. He whispered. The number didn't feel real. It felt like something from another world. 3 days ago, he had been sitting in a roadside motel, wondering if he could afford another night. 3 days ago, he had nothing but $23 in a suitcase. And now he was sitting in front of a fortune that could change thousands of lives. Harold closed the ledger slowly. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then he looked around the attic again. The dusty crates. The quiet house. The letter left behind by a woman who had trusted someone in the future to find this treasure. Harold Whitman exhaled slowly, and in that moment he realized something important. This safe had not just been protecting money, it had been protecting a choice about what kind of man he would become next. Harold Whitman stayed in the attic for a long time after discovering the fortune. The safe remained open behind him, its shelves filled with gold, coins, and bearer bonds that had been hidden away for nearly a century. Any other man might have rushed downstairs, called banks, lawyers, reporters, anyone who would listen. But Harold simply sat there quietly. The flashlight rested beside him on the wooden crate, while the late afternoon sun slipped through the small attic window, casting long golden beams across the dusty floor. He stared down at his hands that had lifted steel beams, hands that had repaired broken machines. Hands that had worked honestly for more than 40 years and never once held more than a modest paycheck. And now, those same hands had just opened a fortune worth $184 million. Harold shook his head slowly. "Well, Eleanor," he said softly into the quiet room, "you certainly kept a secret, but the truth was, the money itself wasn't what occupied his mind. It was something else, a memory, the cold motel room, the flickering neon sign, the feeling of sitting alone in the dark with nowhere left to go. Harold knew something that money alone could never fix: loneliness, abandonment, the quiet pain of being forgotten. He closed the safe gently, not because he feared the fortune, but because he needed time to think. Over the next several days, Harold began cleaning the mansion room by room. The house had clearly once been beautiful, but decades of silence had left their mark. Dust covered nearly every surface. Windows were clouded with frost. Furniture sat draped beneath white sheets like sleeping ghosts from another era. Harold worked slowly. He opened curtains to let sunlight fill the rooms again. He swept the floors. He lit fires in the old stone fireplaces that had not burned in years. The house seemed to breathe again. At night, Harold sat in the library beside the fireplace with Eleanor Whitlock's old letters spread across the table. He read about her life, her husband Charles, the fortune they had built, the careful way they had hidden it to protect it from the chaos of the world. But one sentence from her final letter stayed with him. "True wealth is not what we keep, but what we give." Harold read those words again and again, and slowly an idea began to form. A week later, Harold drove into the town of Colton and visited the small diner he had seen on his way in. The same young gas station clerk sat at the counter drinking coffee. The waitress poured Harold a cup and smiled kindly. "Passing through?" she asked. Harold shook his head. "No, ma'am, I believe I'm staying." Over the next hour he listened more than he spoke. He listened to the quiet struggles of the town. The factory nearby had closed years ago. Jobs had disappeared. Young people moved away whenever they could, and more than a few elderly residents had been left alone after their families moved on. One man at the counter mentioned an older woman who had been living in her car after losing her apartment. Another spoke about a retired veteran who had nowhere to go after his wife passed. Harold sat quietly. Each story felt familiar. Too familiar, because he had almost become one of those stories himself. When he finished his coffee, Harold stood up slowly. He left a $20 bill on the counter. Then he said something that made the waitress pause. "You know that old Whitlock house outside town?" She nodded. "Hard to miss." Harold smiled gently. "Well, I think it's time that place had people in it again." Within months, the mansion began to change. The dusty halls were cleaned. Broken windows were repaired. Warm lights filled rooms that had been dark for decades. But Harold Whitman didn't turn the mansion into a palace. He turned it into a refuge. One by one, the doors opened for people who had nowhere else to go. A retired teacher whose family had forgotten her. A veteran who had lost everything after medical bills. An elderly couple who had been forced out of their home. They arrived with small suitcases, the same way Harold had once arrived. At first, the house held only a few guests, then more. Soon, the mansion was filled with life again. Laughter echoed through the halls. The dining room hosted warm meals every evening. The library became a place where people gathered to read and share stories. The once abandoned mansion slowly transformed into something no one had expected. A second chance. Harold never told most of the residents about the fortune hidden in the attic. To them, he was simply the quiet old man who had opened his doors. The man who fixed broken chairs. Who cooked breakfast on Sundays. Who listened when people needed someone to hear their story. And on cold winter nights, when the snow fell softly outside the tall windows, The mansion that had once stood empty and forgotten now glowed with warmth and life. The house buried in snow had finally found its purpose, because Harold Whitman had discovered something far more valuable than gold. He had discovered what it truly meant to give people hope. Years later, when people in Colton spoke about the old Whitlock mansion, they no longer called it the abandoned house on the hill. They called it Harold's house, not because Harold Whitman owned it, but because he had given it a soul. Visitors who stepped through its doors often expected to meet a wealthy man. After all, rumors about the fortune hidden somewhere inside the old mansion had quietly spread over time. But when they finally met Harold, they usually felt a little surprised. He still wore the same flannel shirts. He still drove the same old pickup truck. And he still spent most mornings fixing broken things around the house. To Harold, the fortune in the attic safe had never been the real treasure. The real treasure was hearing laughter return to empty rooms. It was seeing people who once felt forgotten sit together around a warm dinner table again. It was watching strangers slowly become family. Because Harold Whitman understood something many wealthy people never do. Money can buy comfort, but kindness builds a home. And sometimes the greatest legacy a person leaves behind is simply giving others a place where they are never forgotten again. If this story moved you, take a moment to like the video and share it with someone who might need a reminder that second chances still exist.